So the first paper that I want to talk about this week is called "Does Online Word of Mouth Increase Demand and How?" Evidence from a natural experiment. So this paper draws a lot of motivation from the idea that trying to come up with causal estimates of word of mouth from observational data is going to be particularly hard to do because it's not something that firms can directly control, and it's going to be very hard for us as researchers to directly control. So getting any kind of experimental variation to be able to identify causal effects is quite difficult. It's also, if we think about the observational data idea, just go out and try and observe data on word of mouth online and trace that back to demand. It's going to be difficult because there's also this kind of idea of offline word of mouth in the background, and kind of separating out online and offline might be particularly difficult. Again, if there's not some experiment where I'm randomly moving around the amount of online word of mouth you have access to really break any kind of correlation in observable data between on and offline word of mouth. So what these guys specifically are going after is trying to pin down a demand elasticity. So how much does demand vary with word of mouth? And they're looking at how the demand what is the demand elasticity with respect to the volume of posts. So they're really after a kind of effect of an increase or a decrease in the volume of posts and tracing that down onto its effect on demand. And then thinking about the mechanism through which this might be happening. So why is online word of mouth impacting demand? What is the story? What is the mechanism driving these potential results? How are they going to do this? They're going to focus on a natural experiment. So it's not going to be an experiment where they went out and did some kind of randomization. They're going to be relying on kind of some big exogenous shock, generating a big change in the amount of word of mouth that could be out there to try and trace out the effect on demand. They're going to rely on a shutdown of Sino Weibo, which I'm going to think of as Chinese Twitter. So it's going to be shut down in mainland China for a period of days. So people are not going to be able to post comments on essentially Chinese Twitter for a few days in the mainland China. But that effect is not going to happen in Hong Kong. So it's kind of a natural experiment idea. There's a big shock impacting one country or one part of a country, China, sorry, but not another part of the country, Hong Kong. And they're going to try and use that kind of as an experiment to trace out the effect using this kind of notion of diff and diff, difference and differences, to do it. So I should also say that that shutdown of Chinese Twitter is not due to some effect related to what they're going to be caring about, which is TV viewership. It's due to some kind of political event. So it's going to be, this kind of shutdown is exogenous to the idea of TV viewing, which is going to be what they care about, and kind of conversation and online word of mouth about TV viewing. It's not going to be related to that. So it really is going to be like kind of a valid natural experiment to think about. So they're interested in TV show viewership. In reality, I like to think of it as looking at the effect on kind of long-running kind of C-drama, so Chinese drama shows, and the effect of online word of mouth on the viewership of those shows. Kind of one caveat whenever I think about this paper, and I think about it a lot, is that I don't feel that the idea that these TV shows are necessarily new products. These kind of dramas and TV shows are generally long-lived. They're going to be thinking about. So it's going to be quantifying the effect on word of mouth on what I think to be an existing product. So that might, when you see the results, keep that in mind. So I think that's going to be important for kind of interpreting what we find kind of coming next. What they're going to do is they're going to get data on TV ratings, so viewership, for each episode of a TV show at the city level across different cities in mainland China and Hong Kong. And they also get microblogging activity about each show. So this is like the idea of how much conversation is there on Chinese Twitter about each show. As I said before, the experiment, there's gonna be a block on Chinese Twitter, and it's gonna affect mainland China. So they're not gonna have access to Weibo for a few days, but Hong Kong is. So we're gonna be relying on that difference to kind of compute kind of this natural experiment idea. And I think, as I said a couple of times now, think of this as a large random shock that's unrelated to TV viewing and TV word of mouth, which when I talked through the idea of natural experiments in week 3, that seems to be the conventional wisdom as an okay kind of thought process for a natural experiment. Large random shock, unrelated to the industry that you're particularly focused on. So it's going to be difference in differences, the way they're going to try and estimate these effects. What they're going to have is they're going to have the log ratings, so log viewership in a city on a given day as their Y variable. And they're going to do this regression diff in diff idea. So the coefficient we're going to care about is going to be delta, which is going to be capturing the effect of the interaction between whether there's a block right now at some point in time and whether you're in the mainland. So block equals 1, mainland equals 1. So there's a block right now on mainland China. What is the effect of not having access to Chinese Twitter and not having access to the volume of posts about TV shows I might be interested in on demand? In this case, viewership. Now, thinking about causality, I remember when I talked about this again in week 3, I said, well, make sure there's a valid counterfactual. They're using the idea that viewing patterns in China are going to be approximated by viewing patterns in Hong Kong. So they're going to be similar kind of patterns in viewership over time. And there has to be this no selection on unobservable idea. So there's nothing unobserved really driving the treatment. It's also relevant for TV viewing, the TV word of mouth. So again, it's a political reason this block came in. We're going to be okay there. So we think that what we're going to be estimating is a causal effect, and it's going to be this delta that we're interested in getting. That underscore on the J is not delta J. That's a typo in my notes. So just evidence of whether there might be an effect. Look at a graph. Do you see anything? Diff in diff paper. I want to see some graphical evidence that things are happening. What we see is when this block is in place, which is in this kind of gray bar, you see that there's a big decrease in the number of comments. So I probably didn't pin down exactly what this block was. It's a block in commenting on posts. So you see that there's this big drop off in comments because it was banned in mainland China over this kind of late March 2012 time period, going into early April. So you see there's a block, volume of comments go down by quite a lot. And over the same time, there's a big drop off in viewership at the same time. So there seems to be two things going on: decrease in comments on Chinese Twitter and a decrease in viewership. And we think those two things are related. So we're going to try and estimate that diff in diff model to tease out the effects. The results are in this table 2 of the paper. Let me get some tool to kind of annotate and kind of walk through these results and what we think is important. 1 second. So in column 1, they're not really doing a diff and diff here. They're just regressing viewership on whether there's a block in place or not in mainland China. So think of this as a before, after kind of idea. And they kind of get this effect of minus 0.017. Remember, log y level x, we can interpret that as a percentage. So it seems like there's a 1.7% decrease in the amount of viewing driven by this kind of block of Chinese Twitter and the inability to post comments. Now, to be a full diff and diff, we're going to have that censor dummy interacted with mainland. And that's what we're going to see in column 2. So this is their other kind of main result, think of it as. We're interested in that delta, which is going to be this variable, this coefficient right here, minus 0.026. So this block led to a 2.6% decrease in viewership of these TV dramas during this blockade. That's quite, whether that's small or big, I don't know. I think of it as quite a small effect, right? If we really think that word of mouth might be important, we see this as a small effect of word of mouth on demand for, in terms of this case, viewing of TV. And these kind of other columns 3, 4, 5, and 6 are kind of robustness kind of exercises to show that this kind of small size of the effect is like, really, it's a small size. It's not just an artifact of some particular regression specification. So small effects of volume, turning off volume on demand in terms of being viewership for TV. What's the mechanism at play, right? So the question is, okay, if we found that effect in this diff and diff, why might that be true? What's driving that effect? What's generating that decrease in viewership? And the way that these guys are going to think about it is they're going to interact censorship. So whether Chinese Twitter, there's this block on commenting on Chinese Twitter, they're going to interact that with sentiment, in kind of post-show conversation. So what's the conversation like after a show airs, to try and pinpoint or pin down one of these kind of what is the mechanism going on here. And I think the main effects they're really going to be in columns. So column 1 is just a replication of that main effect, essentially. And columns 2, 3, and 4 are something saying, well, it seems this effect seems to be larger or driven by situations where there's a lot of post-show commenting. So when there'd normally be a large conversation on Twitter after the show aired, that's where we seem to be seeing the big drop-off in viewership. And that's true both whether there's positive sentiment in that post-show discussion or whether there's kind of negative sentiment in that post-show discussion. So it's really this idea of what they like to think of it as its post-show discussion and the inability to engage in that commenting with people, with your friends on Chinese Twitter, driving that decrease in viewership. So they're thinking of this as a consumption complementarity story. So the idea that I don't watch the show when there's a block on Chinese Twitter because I don't get that kind of post-show enjoyment of being able to chat about it online with my friends. So quick takeaways from this paper, I guess. The estimated volume elasticity being between 0.016 and 0.026. So, not having access to the commenting feature decreased demand between 1.6 and 2.6%. And the idea that it worked through this idea of consumption complementarity. I don't watch the TV show because I can't talk about it later with my friends. Managerial implications potentially of what this might be are, at least for these kind of TV shows, these kind of existing TV shows and maybe existing products, this idea of post-show discussion or post-purchase discussion is important. And maybe as a manager or a marketer, fostering that discussion is going to be important for generating demand for your product. People might buy your product so they can engage in this post-show discussion. Elsewhere in the paper, they show that there doesn't appear to be valence or sentiment effects driving demand. So it's not that we're not viewing it because of uncertain, we can't get quality perceptions of the TV show right. So we can't learn about the quality and then make our viewing decision kind of based on that quality signal. I think in this kind of situation, that appears to me to be relatively obvious. And the idea that these TV shows seem to be kind of long-lived TV shows. So, quality is not really unknown for kind of, season 6 of a TV show. So there's not much room for valence to be driving any effect in these results. So the main takeaway, volume elasticities are there. The effects are small, right? Shutting off commenting only decreases demand by around 2.5%. So word of mouth does affect demand, but the effects are going to be small. And one potential mechanism for why could be this idea of consumption complementarities with discussion after purchase.